welcome everybody. It's been a while, and this is the first meetup event in the new year. Very lucky to have Guy here today about a really cool project, and he'll talk about metrics and how that turned out. And I don't want to say too much about it. I've seen the slides, it's pretty cool, and I don't know how to put this in 2 lines, but you will love it, I guess. I'm sure. And yeah, so he was actually meant to be here last year, and we had to postpone it a few times. So I'm really, really happy that it's actually happening. We know each other because he joined some Kanban training with me to finally become a Kanban management professional, and we've got a few
Mhm.
Kanban folks here today as well. How would you think, because it's a Kanban New Zealand event, hey? Yeah, so Guy, if you like, give us a really quick overview around where you're working. And I think the talk is about where you're working at the moment and so
Yeah.
forth. And I hand over to you.
Okay. So my name is Guy Maslen. I've been doing Agile and Scrum kind of things since about 2009. Started off doing that with a software team who came to me one day and said, "We're in trouble. We want to try out this Agile thing." And I was their boss, and I said, "Okay, tell me about it." And that led me to where I am now. Right now, I'm working as technical delivery lead at the Tertiary Education Commission. I've been doing that full time since July. Prior to that, I was contracting as a Scrum Master with them, working on this big project we're going to talk about for about 3 years. And prior to that, I was at New Zealand Defence Force with a couple other people in the audience. Um, and really, what I'm going to talk about here is going to talk to you about a project that I was on, and going to going to look at that project and what we can understand about that project through both through Kanban eyes and systems thinking eyes, and also looking a little bit at the people and what the impact was on the people as well. And then when I go through those things, then we'll kind of look at the project, how the project evolved, and hopefully you'll start seeing some of the patterns and some of the things that might have been perhaps unpredictable, right? And might have been unknowns, and things that might look familiar to you might be things that we can think about, ways in which we can incorporate into our planning, incorporate into our projects, and maybe give a better steer to our organizations on things like when things will be delivered, when will it be done? Which of course is the thing that everyone wants to know, alongside how much will it cost. Um, so stepping forward, once upon a time there was a project, and the real project, and I talked to my bosses and they said they can talk about it. We're replacing 3 legacy systems. Now it's a much bigger program. Program was 3 or 4 years long, but what we're talking about here is just replacement of 3 legacy systems. And in fact, we're just going to look at one of them that's called the single data return. And in New Zealand, 3 times a year, every single tertiary education organisation, so every polytech, every university, every college that does tertiary education, submits 5 comma-separated variable text files. And those files cover all the information about every single student, the courses they're doing, the qualifications they've completed, how far through, what qualifications they're taking, how far through they are, what sites they'll be taught at, and all these kind of things, right? And that information is used in 2 ways. The first is based on those numbers, right, when they submit for their first time in the December round, is how much money they get paid, because all that money comes out from TDC, right? And then in the April round, there's a check-in on how they're doing, if students dropped out or so on. And then there's a wash-up round in the December round again, where it's like, well, was there a difference between what we paid you, right, and how many students you actually had and those that dropped out, right? And so the total amount of money involved is about $6 billion all up. And obviously, this is flowing into our universities and polytechs, and therefore, it's got to be right, right? This is what keeps our tertiary education system in New Zealand alive and afloat. But just dealing with that single data return system and how the information comes in, there's about 350 business rules, right, that validate those files. And they check things like, is this person a valid student? They check the student number. They cross-check things like, is this student a New Zealand citizen? Do they have citizenship information and so forth? Or are they a foreign student? There's lots of stuff about ethnicity, about age, about general demographics, as well as all the course information. And there's certain things that you can apply for funding for, and some courses that aren't funded, or people who have applied in the past, and this kind of thing, right? Now, when this project was running, the timeframes are pretty tight, and they were trying to work for a pilot group of 12 TOs, which included Victoria University in Auckland by December 2024. But then the plan was, having got that group of 12 working successfully, we're going to open up to everybody in March 25 for the April submission round. Right? And there's some additional post-deployment work to do. So while the basic stuff's been done, we're putting some bells and whistles onto the system and letting them, log some of the types of data and the types of reports and so forth. And we're going to hand over to the business in sometime in July or August 2025, right? So that was our plan going forward, right? But before we go into that, right, based on that kind of plan, based on that kind of stuff, key questions, right? What things might go adrift, right? So what assumptions might we be making that are unspoken? What don't we know? What are when we're planning out a project like this? What that mean in terms of the delivery, right? And how might that impact on the team? And that's the three kind of things we're going to explore, right? So first thing I'm going to talk about is technical debt. Now, I'm a bit of a fan of XKCD cartoons. If you've not seen them before and you want to lose yourself, go to xkcd.com and look through them. There's lots of really good technical stuff, and it's entirely possible that someone in the audience wants to have one of these pinned to my door for a while, one of these cartoons. So here you see our erstwhile hero who decides, I could just restructure the program's flow, a lot of work, or I could just use GoTo. What's the worst thing that could possibly happen? And he gets eaten by a velociraptor. Now, that isn't exactly what's going to happen when we start getting into technical debt, but it's the kind of things that can go wrong. So technical debt is when we focus on short-term value. Right? And there's always a reason. So we take a pragmatic shortcut. And that's often because we've got cost or time pressure, right? There's something called LeBlanc's law, which is later equals never. Oh, we'll fix that later. And we all know that good agile practice would have us doing, in the classical extreme programming sense, would have us doing red, green refactor. So we'd write our test, the test had failed, that's the red, rewrite the code until it passes the test, that's the green, and then refactor the code so it's clean and tight and good order, right? And so if we skip that last step, we end up with complex or hard to maintain code, right? Sometimes we might make exceptions to our architectural design, right? So we might not be able to fully go down or fully implement all the elements of what we want to do. So we take another system and make a shortcut. And that can create security or efficiency problems further downstream. And then we get to something that's a bit more, even more pragmatic, test cases that are limited or not fully explored, right? So we do test cases, but there's not a complete study of the unhappy and unhappy path. We don't look at the complete cyclomatic complexity, every branch through the code. And then the final one is technology or dependencies close to obsolescence. So we build as part of a system, and we know that's going to, we know that the length of the system, the duration of the system we're building for, we might have to replace something, or something's close to obsolescence, or there's a library that's on a version that's N-5 or N-8, and we don't upgrade it, and that creates sort of potential problems. And what we're balancing here, and that the idea on the picture on the left is balancing, we're balancing out the short-term cost of delay against the long-term cost of rework. And the reason why it's called technical debt is getting it right at the time, doing it right at the time, will always be cheaper than coming back and fixing it later, right? And so there's always an interest to be paid back. So to put that into a Kanban context, what we're actually talking about is when we've got a fixed date, right? So fixed date class of service, there is a cost of delay after a known future date that's very high and possibly unaffordable. Now, to be clear here, I'm not talking about deadlines that somebody just made up, and if we go past the deadline, that's their ego or things like this. I'm talking about stuff like compliance. So, for example, if there's some change to government policy and you've got to get it out by a certain date or in place by a certain place due to legislation, you've got a compliance cost. There's a legal problem if you don't. Buying cycles matter. If you're producing a consumer product and it's not available before Black Friday, your sales will suffer as a result. And you get buying cycles in various industries. You might be producing software for a particular event, like the census. You can't be 2 weeks late with your census software. It's got to go live and scale on the day of the census. You can't be late for the software to help run the Olympics, for example. And then there's also the impact of in terms of support. So if you're working with a contract team to develop something, and those contractors are all going to roll off, right? That's a fixed date, right? And while you can extend it, it's going to cost money. There is a cost impact that you've not planned for after that fixed date. So that's the fixed date side of things. Um, Technical debt falls into the intangible class of service. And the intangible class is that the cost of delay is small but rising. And then at some unknown point in the future, it's going to escalate rapidly and become very large. So an example might be you build a system that's got poor demand scalability, and that's not a problem until you've got demand, and then it's a crisis. Or you can't extend it. So you've got a system and some change needs to be made, and it's very expensive to modify it. Um, you tested your happy path, but not the unhappy path, right? And then lots and lots of defects start coming in, or your edge case testing was weak. Those are just examples. What we're actually talking about here in real practical sense, for those of us who work in large scale software service delivery, what we're talking about is P1, P2 incidents, right? Or P3 and P4 incidents, but we're talking about, suddenly you've set the world on fire, and you've set the world on fire because you left something like a ticking time bomb, right? A piece of technical debt you didn't retire. And so, it's not unusual to find, say, contract projects making pragmatic decisions and then leaving a certain amount of mess for the main business team to pick up afterwards, right? And things come out of the woodwork. But that's what we're talking about in terms of technical debt and what that means in a Kanban terminology. Does that make sense to everyone? Any questions so far? Okay. So now I'm going to talk about it from a different perspective. I'm going to talk about it from a systems thinking perspective. Now, I'll go a little bit slower here because this is, if you've not come across system thinking archetypes, this needs a bit of work. But in Kanban again, we try and apply systems thinking. So within our team, we look at flow. When we start looking at our team of teams, and we start looking at how information is connected across our organization and the wider complex system that our organization has, where information flows from architects into the team and all the way around. Right? We start thinking about that wider system and how that works, not just optimizing for our team, but optimizing for the whole. So a little bit of an explanation first. What's a system thinking archetype? An archetype's a common pattern. And it deals with the big picture, not specific detail. And there's a number of these core archetypes that you find in systems thinking. And they're core archetypes because they crop up again and again and again in different businesses. Okay. And so much so that they've all got names, right? And things like the tragedy of the commons, right? Or success to the successful, or accidental adversaries, are all about how the interconnecting relationships and the interconnecting flow of information or flow of something, right, creates a complex system. And so that's how we kind of understand the system. We think of it in terms of connections. And then when those connections form feedback loops is when things start to get interesting. Okay. And there's three basic kinds of relationships. We've got subtractive, right? So thing one makes thing two get smaller. And the example I've got here is sales decrease your inventory. So you've got an inventory of stuff, you sell some of it, and the sales decrease it. On the other side of the fence, we've got an additive relationship. Sales increase our revenue. So we're decreasing our inventory and increasing revenue. And there's also a constant relationship, in this case, raw materials to fixed goods. We've still got the same amount of stuff, but they're flowing across, right? Now I'll take you through a couple of system thinking archetypes as explanation, and then I'll bring that into what that means for technical debt. Okay. So the simplest reinforcing loop I can think about, the growth loop, and that's supposed to be a little seed growing there, is compound interest. We have an interest rate, right? And that acts to produce an amount of interest. And that's a constant relationship. Interest rate goes up, interest payment goes up. And we've got our principal amount here. We add interest in, we generate some interest, we add the interest to the principal, and we're going around a reinforcing or growth loop. And what that looks like, a growth loop looks like an exponential increase, right? Here we've got a balancing loop. Now, I didn't explain this particularly well, but the best explanation I've got for this desired state, gap state business is reversing into a car park. So you're reversing into a car park and you pull up and you see that actually the gap between you and the curb is too big. You're too far out, right? So you want to apply a corrective action. So you do some maneuvering and you reverse again. There's a little bit of a time delay, so the stopwatch indicates. You check your current state and the gap's gotten smaller. Has the gap reached the desired state? Well, maybe, maybe not. So maybe you go around again. But this time, you're applying smaller and smaller corrective actions until you reach your desired distance. And so that would give us this kind of curve, right? A flattening curve, right? So that's a balancing loop where we're holding things to the back and eventually things balance out and come to an equilibrium. Yeah. So that's two types of loop, a reinforcing loop and a balancing loop, kind of examples of how they come together. So what does that all mean in a technical debt sense? And what does it mean in terms of making predictions about what technical debt will do to our project? So here we go. We're taking pragmatic shortcuts to reach a delivery target or a service level agreement. I say SLA here because you see this quite a lot with people closing tickets, right? Where they're getting incident tickets in and they're judged on how quickly they can close a ticket, right? They'll just close the ticket as quickly as they can, not necessarily in a long-term way, right? So they might close the ticket and then the next week the same problem comes up. They're not fixing the software so they don't get the same ticket happen, right? So what happens is your velocity, your throughput's increasing because you're taking shortcuts and you're gradually, this reinforcing loop is allowing you to move lots and lots of information through very quickly. On the negative side, right, the technical debt you're accruing by taking those shortcuts with a time delay, right, is starting to have a negative impact and starts to balance out the growth. So we've got the growth on this side, like our compound interest, and we've got the balancing on this side, right? And we'll hit a limit when the bug fixes that are coming in start to overwhelm delivery. And so while initially your delivery might start to rise exponentially, yeah, we're really hitting the mark here, and you're expecting this to carry on or get better. Once this balancing loop's really kicked in, and once the number of defects and the amount of time on defects rises up, then the team's ability to deliver is going to flatten out, right? And your ability to drive new stuff's going to fall, right? And then if you continue with this and the bugs continue to increase and you get completely overwhelmed, then bad things will happen. Perhaps the team gets stressed out, perhaps the problem solved, perhaps your project gets shut down, right? So when we start accruing technical debt and we start building up that technical debt, we know there's going to be a payback and we know that's going to kick in, right? And unlike the sort of exponential growth of interest on earnings, what that's going to do is limit our ability to deliver and cause things to flatten out. So there we've looked at technical debt from just sort of a structural point of view. We've looked at it both from what that means in Kanban classes of service, and we've used systems thinking to predict what's going to happen if we let technical debt run amok, right? We're going to see our delivery increase at first, then flatten off entirely, right? So typically what happens is to hit a fixed or due date, we make pragmatic choices. When we make those choices, we accrue technical debt. That technical debt exists whether it's visible or not. I've got quite strict on this now, and I insist my teams, if they take a shortcut or do something quickly, we put the story to fix it into the backlog in a future sprint somewhere, right? But it's still there whether you fix it or not. And technical debt's got an intangible cost of delay, but eventually impacts on future delivery of service or your future SLAs. Then you might fall into the trap of making further pragmatic decisions and doing a quick fix and a quick fix. And eventually that hits a limit to growth. And for an agile context, a limit to growth would be change is no longer cheap, easy, fast, or safe, right? So change becomes expensive, right? Hard, slow, and risky. Now, if you've worked on a big system, like a big data warehouse system or whatever, where they've made a lot of pragmatic decisions over the years, then that system can quite literally become unsupportable. And I've seen this in a number of code bases where you get to the point where nobody can actually figure out how to repair it safely, right? Particularly if you haven't got good automated test suites and so forth. And often what happens at that point is someone comes along and suggests rewriting it from scratch, right? Now, that's a model. It's a model that works in terms of, every 5 or 7 years we'll completely rewrite our systems. But really, when we move to the cloud and we move to continuous delivery, we want to try and avoid that kind of thing. Uh, and I guess the analogy is, we've got our all modern data infrastructure here, and a project some random person in Nebraska has been thankfully maintaining since 2003. There's often some piece of technical debt buried, some legacy system that might not be maintained that can actually bring down quite a lot. We might know about some of it, we might not know about other bits. But that's typically the cycle we find in. I don't know if people have come across that, but that's what you tend to see quite a lot. Okay, so that's technical debt and things that happen on projects where you've got technical debt from sort of a project management perspective, I suppose. But what about the people? And what we're talking about here is context switching. And, like good lean people, when there's a problem, we pull on the and-on cord. And so the and-on cord was the whole thing in Toyota production lines, where rather than let the production line stop, you could pull a cord and everybody would swarm and try and solve your problem. And I've used this in a bunch of situations where, when you've got a problem, the whole resource of the organization are brought to bear on it. And it's typically what we talk about in an ITIL sense, a P1 or a P2 incident, right? P1 incident, we convene a war room, we bring in everybody we could possibly need to help solve the problem. And it's do now, right? It's expedite. We're pivoting to an expedite class of service in Kanban speak. And normally we have some kind of triage process, and this is kind of what the triage process looks like where I am. P1 or P2 incident to do now. P3 is probably try and get it done this sprint, and a P4 incident will be doing a future sprint, right? So, I mean, ideally triage is like do now, do later, or not going to fix. It's dead. But that's kind of our triage. Now, generally speaking, you've got the team working on the roadmap. And when they're working on the roadmap, particularly if you're using Scrum with a common sprint goal or something like that, the team's all collaborating on a feature. They're in the same areas of the code base. They're working backwards and forwards. They're supporting each other. Everything's refined. It's all planned work. Incident response, bit different. Someone's got to investigate the problem, some random part of the code base. Maybe it's something they worked on. Maybe it's something they didn't. It's undefined and unplanned work. So it's pretty disruptive, right? And this is where the idea of working memory comes into play. Now, our brains don't really have a whole chunk of it set aside as working memory as a computer does, but it's a useful construct from a neurological and psychological perspective to understand why context switching is bad. So our working memory is short term, it's temporary storage, and it's where we manipulate information, right? And it's also where we focus our attention. And it's finite. We can only hold so much in our working memory, and it's linked into our brain chemistry pretty hard and our brain chemical cycles in terms of like potassium ion discharge and things. It's depleted by heavy lifting, by which I mean if you do a deep dive session, you're really focusing on something difficult and to concentrate on, our working memory is reduced. Stress also depletes our working memory, right? Because we're focusing on other things. And then we require some recovery time. The best example I've got for you of working memory is when we enter a space, our brains, from an evolutionary perspective, run a memory wipe on part of our working memory. And they blank it. And they blank it to give you the space, right, the mental space, to look around the room, see what you can see, put some attention on it, and manipulate that information. And evolutionary speaking, it's looking for threats or reward. Is there a pot of gold here or a monster, right? If you've ever walked into a room and forgotten why you're there, right? Forgotten why you came into the room. I came here to pick something up, and what was it? That's the process you're seeing. Your brain is wiping your working memory flat, so you've got space to process any problem you might encounter in the room. And you can see from an evolutionary standpoint why that's a good thing. You don't want someone walking into a cave and being pounced on because they didn't check the corners of the cave. But that's a good example of how working memory can work, right? And that's a good example of a slip, right? We're in the middle of executing something, and suddenly our working memory fails us, and there's an execution error. Other things that happen when we overload it, our working memory elapses, which is we do the right things in the wrong sequence, so we forget a step, right? We make mistakes. A mistake is a planning error. So we try and do something, it doesn't work. And it shouldn't be a surprise because last time we tried to do that, it didn't work either, but we kind of forgotten because our working memory was overloaded. And eventually you get to brain fog. And if you've experienced brain fog as a part of COVID or anything else, it's where your working memory simply is done. And you can't actually really process information very well anymore because you've got so little working memory left that difficult problems are too hard. Um, Now, this is something I did. One or two people who might have done this with me actually. I ran a context switching workshop, and I've done this a few times. And it's based on something called Three Projects, Three Experiments on a website that used to be there called Tasty Cupcakes. I'd heard a whole bunch of games like this around Agile and stuff. It's gone now, but you can still find them on Wayback Machine. Um, and it gave you some exercise to do. So in the first round, you go around the room and you count from 1 to 30, then say the alphabet, then count from 2 to 56 in twos. And each person would say their name, then the number or letter, and then the next person goes around the room. Easy. The next time, you give them something else to do as well, which is passing a ball between each other, and counting off 100 ball passes. And then the third time, um, as the boss, I change their priorities. So every time I say change, they move from counting from 1 to 30 to the alphabet to counting up in twos, forward and backwards. So every time they're told to swap the sequence, they have to do it. Um, I ran it with two groups, one group of managers, one group of engineers. The engineers, bless their cotton socks, set somebody up to do QA who was checking that they didn't miss everything and reminding people where they'd started, which is what engineers are good at, right? So that was kind of funny. Managers didn't. By the time it got to experiment three, the managers lost track. And in fact, um, one particular person who's a good friend turned around to me and said, I can't think anymore, and burst out laughing. I'll always remember that. Right? But a number of people said afterwards it took them time to recover from this, right? It took them several hours for their brains to recover from that deliberately induced overload. And this is what we're doing to people when we give them, when we context switch them and suddenly pull them out of some deep work, give them a problem to solve over here, then give them another bug and everything else. But it's not cohesive, focused work. That's what we're doing to our teams. It's not quite that simple. Um, there's quite a few papers listed there, but the main takeaways are if you're context switching between two or three activities, it's going to cost an extra 17 to 19%. In a practical sense, a team that is doing just roadmap work and then suddenly switches across and starts to have to do maybe 30 or 40% BAU, 30, 40% bug fixing, you will see their throughput, their velocity, whatever, drop by about 20%, right? And that's that context switching coming into play, right? So the more of that they have to do, the more complicated things are, the less work they'll do, the more cohesive and focused the work, the more they'll get done. Takes about 15 to 25 minutes to get back into flow. Performance falls off after about 90 minutes on broken on a single task. That's why it's actually, I mean, about 40 minutes is pretty good. So why it's good to keep meetings to 45 minutes, not run a full hour. You'll get about 30, 40 minutes of heavy lifting if you want people to think really hard. Unscheduled interruptions create stress through trying to catch up. So that's, we've got a team that's working. Some people are still on the roadmap. Some people are doing bugs. All of a sudden, you need the person who's working on a bug. You need their attention to be able to help you with something that's your main core thing. So you tap them on the shoulder, and of course they want to help, so they help you, and then they've got to go back again, right? So as soon as you've got multiple priorities in the team, all that sort of thing starts to kick in, right? Work that can be easily paused, more easily recovered, is just another advertisement for slice small. The smaller you slice things, the more you reduce the risk of the work being disrupted. It's less efficient, but you're improving the risk, right? And then there's something called the Pomodoro technique, where you work in 30-minute blocks, doing 25 minutes of work and 5 minutes of rest, and you allow the brain that recycle time. And the neuroscience behind that's pretty solid, even though when the guy came up with Pomodoro, which literally means tomato, because he was using a tomato timer, the guy came up with it just found it out by accident, more or less. But there's there's a whole paper there on someone actually using it in agile software development and how it improved throughput. Worth a read as well. Gloria Mark's stuff on interrupted work is a great one as well if you want some stuff to take to your management and explain why you don't want to context switch people around. Anyway, so we covered off two core things there in some detail. And the first one was talking about the technical debt and the impact that has from a sort of technological perspective on our project, what we might expect to see where we've allowed technical debt to accrue, both from a systems thinking and a Kanban perspective and what that means. And then we've also kind of looked at technical debt from it's going to force context switching and what that might do to the team. So back to this project we've got working. We've had a pilot group go out with very tight deadlines, right? And then that team has rolled off, right? Another team's picked up the work and is carrying on doing some extensions heading into that April round. So here we are. Variation on a burn down chart. The blue bar is how much work we've got left, and the green is how much closed work we've done. The reason I do that, you'll see later, is you'll get to see if the total work increases or not, right? So when you get a little bit more than a burn down. Here's our planned target delivery day. We're predicting about 28 stories per sprint based on probabilistic modeling. The initial focus is on those 12 pilot education organizations. We developed the 350 rules. We use their previous submissions as our test data set to make sure everything worked for those 12. Pilot runs successfully, squads disbands, and the second phase of post-deployment work goes to a new squad. What do you think might happen over the next 4 sprints? Bearing in mind that that April submission round kicks off in about March. Any thoughts? This is real data, by the way. I'm not cooking this. So what happens is we get some discovered work. Now, that is really, really common on agile projects, on any project, is you map it all out, you scope it all out, you start work in the first sprint, you go, hang on a minute, there's all this stuff we didn't think about, and that big thing actually needs to get sliced smaller. And I see this a lot, right? From the initial planning, if you're doing PI planning, that kind of thing, you often get about a 20% uplift, right? And it seems reasonably standard, right? Because until you actually get down and start the doing, you don't necessarily uncover all the things. And so that's okay. So we get a bit of an uplift, and you can see what I mean about the total bar going up. So there is total amount of work remains increased, and that's lifted up our bar here, right? And then we get into a little bit of a burn down in the first sprint. Then they find their stride a bit, and they start delivering as a team, and we get a bit faster burn down. We come to here. There's our 28 line coming down, target date. We've slipped out by about a sprint, okay? And we're just coming up to the start of that March submission round, okay? So delivery's pushed out, but everything's manageable. No one's really concerned yet. Okay. Okay, here comes the next 4 sprints. Bam. We are flatlining on our roadmap. A little bit of movement, but nothing really changing. But the total amount of work is going up, right? What's happened is those April submissions have started, right? We're not going to 12 tertiary education organisations anymore. We're going to every tertiary education organisation in the whole of New Zealand. And guess what? That didn't uncover every single edge case, every single problem, every single variation. It didn't really cover off testing all of those rules. So in focusing on getting the 12 organisations through, they were making pragmatic choices to make sure the first part of the programme was a success. All well and good. Now, with wider, more complex data, we start finding more edge cases. We get false rejections. We get unknown error, right? Where something's coming through and the validation's not quite right, and we're dropping out the bottom. So the team is now pivoting to address defects. The total burn down or burn up or amount of work being done is less than 28 stories per sprint. It's something more like 2021, right? That's because of the context switching, because they're continuously pulling in a new bug, investigating it. We're having triage meetings, we're having P1 meetings. People are getting very worried because this data has to get submitted and go through to be reported on a ministerial level. And the team is pivoting all the time to address defects for about 8 weeks. I was actually chatting to I caught up with the principal developer on Monday for a coffee, and I was telling him about this. And when I mentioned this phase of the project, he just lowered his head and shook his head like this. And it was not a fun time. But go forward another 4 sprints, we stabilize, right? Team ramps up on refactoring, team ramps up on testing, big concerted effort on building an integrated test suite at the same time. Huge amount of work getting done. And you can see the total amount of work rising, 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 rising as we look at the closed and the done, and then leveling out. A little bit of a wiggle. And then round about, it's probably round about the start of June, everything starts to stabilize and we're back to our nice burn down line and everything gets delivered. So when the context switching stopped, throughput went back to the originally statistically modeled throughput, right? The probabilistic forecast. And the team was a lot happier. They were feeling more productive. It wasn't just whack-a-mole bug fixing. And we continued to complete the project out. Now, the main things here is statistical forecasting is absolutely critical here. Right? What we couldn't be doing is sitting down and trying to sit down with the team and play penny poker on bugs and say, is this a 5 or an 8? Right? We need to be able to give an immediate response to what the deadlines look like now, where we might deliver now. Right? We've got continuous data coming in, and the question being asked is always, when will this be done? When will the main work be done? That allows us to communicate better. We can make decisions to extend contractors, manage expectations with the business. And that was really one of the powerful take homes here for me was like, it's all well and good coming into a project and assuming that your backlog is all you're going to get, right? But that isn't how a project would unfurl. And now my expectation is within the first couple of sprints, we might get a 20% uplift in terms of the total. And if we do have, and we are picking up on a previous release or something else has been done, or there's other work in the background that we know about in terms of technical debt, then we can reasonably expect, right, a degree where we're going to be flatlining, making less progress before we start to bite in, right? I mean, in a perfect world, we would never have to put that technical debt in the first place. In a perfect world, we could just focus on delivery. In a perfect world, we would have zero defects. But often we're forced to make pragmatic choices. When we do, there's a price to pay on them. So it's the main sort of take-home messages from this for me would be pragmatism has its price. So if you value short-term delivery over long-term quality, it'll be expensive. And that limit to growth systems thinking archetype will hit hard. It will eat your delivery speed. Keep focus where you can, because when intangibles become expedite, your team will context switch, your throughput will drop by 20%, and frankly, you'll burn people out a little bit. And discovered work happens. Statistical forecasting lets you get to the impact of that discovered work quickly. And forecasts are there to give you a leading indicator you need to change scope, budget, or time. And good long-range statistical forecasting is helpful from a management context in that way. Okay. That's all I have to say. Are any questions, comments?
Thank you, Guy. Any questions? Opening the room or ideas or
insults?
I like how you call it pragmatic.
It is. I mean, I think we can be very cruel about, being forced to make choices that are less than ideal. But the reality is we're often in that position, right? We often do have to choose a pragmatic choice about not doing things quite as well as we want. And we can get all real technical and say, no, 100% quality and all the rest of it. But the reality is it's too hard to do. We're actually on that project, actually, at the point at which we were discussing this stuff. One of the senior developers, who was a really interesting guy, had actually worked with Alistair Cockburn in London at one point. Our boss turned around, our program manager turned around, and said, well, the amount of refactoring and tests you want to put in, that's going to take too long. And so he turns back to him and goes, well, how many defects you want? And the boss went, well, 0 defects. And he said, well, that'll be 6 months longer. And then he said, this is not a space program, a manned moon program. Okay. We don't need 0 defect criticality on this, right? What would really be an acceptable level of defect? And I can tell you roughly how long it will take to get there, right? And that was a really good conversation, because initially it was quite a shocking conversation, but the manager sort of thought about that for a bit and realized that, this guy's actually, if you want zero defects, he will give you zero defects, but it's going to be really expensive in that context. We're going to have to make some pragmatic decisions. We're going to have to write the tests around key areas. So a bunch of stuff in the chat. Oh wow!
Yeah.
Did Agile Alliance pick to the Tasty Cupcake games? Brilliant, great. I didn't know that. I will look. Thank you, Philippa.
Oh, I run into it by coincidence. Sorry.
No, that's a really good find. I was a bit gutted when I was doing this talk and went looking for it again, and then couldn't find it except on Wayback Machine, which is not terribly pretty. So that's really good. Thank you.
Ange.
Yeah, I'm here. So what made me, you've managed to put into one sort of big colossal ball of wool. These are things that happen all the, as a Scrum Master, and there's little slices that happen in our lives, and then bam, you got the whole deal. Quite impressive, isn't it, when you look at it from your perspective?
Yeah, but I mean, and that's the thing about this sort of being almost an archetype of a project, right? Because we all see this all the time. And, Duresh, you put a comment there, inherited decisions and imposed work's a real thing. It is, right? Sometimes we're brought in at a late stage, and the work I'm doing now, there have been technical decisions and technical debt accrued on another part of the program I had no control over. And right now I'm doing a similar kind of exercise with that, right? Which is, going back and giving a reforecast and giving a new delivery date and all these things, right? And I can turn around and put my hand up and go, well, it's not my fault, and everyone knows it's not my fault. I've still got to deal with it. I've still got to tell them when it will be, when will it be done, and how much is it going to cost is still the question they want to hear from me. So doesn't go away.
Has anyone else been in this movie?
I'm living it at the moment
Oh.
for one of the things I'm working on.
Tell us more, Helen.
I think I said it just then, but often it's outside of our control. They're things that happen to you, decisions that are made, within the company or other projects or other teams. And mine actually, I have a feeling is, and it sounds silly, is actually related to how bonuses are applied. And I'm sure, sometimes you might be all aware, but, there's the end of year kind of thing, and you've got to get your project delivered. And I'm being pushed by, and I'm saying, as Guy said, you can only make things visible. Like what's the impact of this decision that you're making? But often that's quite hard when you're working with business stakeholders, not technical people. They don't care if something's going to be hard for a team to maintain or whatever, if it's so
They're focused on outcomes. They're not on
correct
the sort of, and unfortunately, and you see it all the time, is in this world we live in now, where everything's now, we want it now.
Yes,
it has to
now.
be. And why can't I have it now? And they just don't get it, and they don't want to, because they don't really care.
I think you just have to give them the options and explain what the consequences are. From as Guy said, especially cost. I think cost definitely is when they start to see that in some real numbers, that's when they stop and have a think about it.
So we've got this interesting thing now where our product owners come from the business side, right? And so the people who are doing the triaging of the incidents and the BAU work are also the people who want the whole system delivered. And so the business now makes all the priority decisions about whether we should be working on an incident or delivering on the roadmap of what they want us to create for them. And it's a new dynamic in our organization, but boy, is it fascinating, because all of a sudden they own both sides of the coin. So they can't just say we want everything all at once. They have to actually make the choice, and they're going like, well, guns or butter, do we need to fix these things or do that? And everything's important, and this is the team's resources, and these are the consequences and the costs. And so it's actually, I mean, if you can, that's creating a tremendously collaborative relationship in my organization, right? Because the business is now collaborating with IT backwards and forwards. We all want the same things. And like Andrew and like you were saying, I mean, it touches on the whole gold wrap thing. Tell me how you're going to measure me, and I'll tell you how I'm going to behave, right? So if you're going to measure me on the basis of delivering my bonus, or if my bonus depends on how many tickets I'm going to close, well, boy, I'll close a lot of tickets, right? Um, and if I'm closing, if I'm closing a lot of tickets, I'm not necessarily preventing new tickets from being opened in the future because you didn't incentivize me to prevent tickets from existing in the first place, right?
Yeah.
So that happens a fair bit, and you create it sort of fairly perverse incentives around, if you always praise people.
The more tickets you close, the more the customer will come back, failure demand, and the more it's actually you can put your bonus upwards really well.
If you praise firefighting, it's not, well, the old saying is if you praise firefighting, you get arsonists, and I wouldn't go that far, and no one's deliberately sabotaging the code. But if you're always praising the people who find and break and fix the defects, then you're certainly not encouraging defect prevention, right?
Yeah.
And if you're going to call out and have a shout out and say, this team worked really long hours to get this across the line, brilliant, and they solved these problems late at night and all the rest of it. And there's the team that did the completely flawless project because everyone did defect prevention and it rolled out and there weren't anything and they never get a whisper. Well, I mean, you're not exactly incentivizing the right behaviors,
No, but that's anyway. Oh, what else do you say? It's just like,
yeah.
I mean, it's reminds me of Goddard's law. The when a measure becomes a target, is it? It stops being a good measure.
Yeah. I find a lot of. I believe in data. I don't believe in metrics. There you go. I believe in using data to understand our business, but the point at which we dumb them down to metrics, which are good or bad or up or down, and we distill down the understanding of our organization to something that's like an A/B thing, then probably they're going to get gained, right? So data matters a lot, but metrics not so much.
I definitely see that gaming all the time, because people, especially if there's something that's incentivized, where there's a conversation going on in my company about, incentivizing on metrics. And I'm like, no, because you can see it now. It's all green, but it's not green. Everyone thinks it's going swimmingly, and I mean, no one's stupid. I mean, all of the senior leaders and everyone are going, hold on, it can't be 100%. Like, that's just not real. But no one's having the brave conversations to say, some people are, but and definitely should not be linked to performance and definitely not to bonus. I said, I'm not going to sign up for that. That is just, it's ludicrous. Yeah.
Maybe to bring that Kanban lens in a little bit, whatever we do in Kanban is to spark meaningful conversations. And I'm a really big fan to put that data, like not just analyze it and think what it means, but actually put it in front of everybody. What does everybody see? Like make it a retrospective, like this would be a higher level in terms of maturity model or maturity level conversation to actually use data to have the good conversations you need to have. And then there will be different opinions, different angles to it.
I remember David Anderson, there's some of the first material, and it's always stuck in my mind, but it's make everything visible. And he doesn't mean just work, as you say.
And it's not just it's also data,
and I never, hearing you say that, that's exactly what that is meant. Yeah, it's not just all make work all visible, which it was initially, but it is about making everything visible. Yeah.
I mean, in that simple sentence, I said there is a lot in it, right? It starts from where start from where you are now. There is also in it leadership at all levels, because if everybody looks at the data, that will incentivize people. It will just make people do things. They will start moving.
Yeah,
You don't need to
totally.
tell them that they're allowed to. They will.
Yeah, that's a big part of it is almost the permission to act. And we've been doing quite a lot of work with my current team in that kind of space, right? And getting people to think about the board, getting people to think that is starting, stop. I mean, even just working through the basics, stop starting, start finishing. Just thinking about the prioritization of, the most important thing here is not pulling another piece of development work. The most important thing is, um, you know, closing out the bugs that have just been found in pre-production so we can take this piece of work live, right? And like context switching will cost you 20% in terms of throughput. Just thinking a bit more intelligently about and getting the team to think about flow of work and just some real simple things and talking about that and maybe playing, an online Kanban game or two or whatever it is. And we've seen, on the opposite side, about a 20% improvement in the team's delivery, just because they're thinking more smartly about where work's stuck and where the bottlenecks are. And my big thing at the moment is trying to bring WIP limits in, and we're working towards that and reduce the WIP. Um, but the huge success is everyone's started to understand what context switching is, why it's bad. The data's there in front of management saying why it's impacts on delivery, and right up to senior management. And so in our governance group meetings, we're talking about trying to avoid context switching in the team because of the impact it has on delivery, right? That's a huge victory, right? They're not seeing people in the team as cogs that can just be thrown at any problem and chopped around. So I mean, all of this stuff is real and what we're trying to do. And this is the conversation I've been having at work, and it does work, but it takes time, right? And you need to you need to bring your receipts. You need to be able to show through the data on the project that, the system's thinking. You got to show it's not theoretical. You got to show the theory actually predicts. So in a scientific sense, a theory predicts the outcome, right? It's not a piece of textbook work. And a good theory predicts an outcome, and a bad theory doesn't tell you what's going to happen. And in this case, systems thinking, and the limits to growth archetype predicts what you're going to see in terms of delivery. The context switching stuff predicts what you're going to see in terms of delivery, and it really does.
Mm. What's really cool when you actually start to visualize and think across borders is also that word will spread when there is a success story. And when you start working in this way, there will be a success story for and probably not in years, but rather in weeks or months, that you will see things improve. And then, so from my experience, the next team will come on board and will ask, can we have this too? These people, like, they seem to be happier because they actually, they have the better conversations. They seem to work better and they're actually delivering. So they're getting actually some reward. So can we have this too, please? And that's how it spreads.
It's not everywhere. You're
Now
right, Philippe.
you have to start small. So it's like when I started, it's always my start small, produce a success story, and it'll spread. It's like a
And
virus in the organization. A good
and
one.
and to Philippe's point there, having those conversations at management levels near unicorn, I feel quite blessed to have had a very fortunate career in various ways and been in companies by and large where those conversations have been possible. And certainly the time I worked at GNS Science, the time I worked in GNet, it was that environment. And TEC is that environment. And so I feel quite blessed from what I hear from other contractors working around different shops in town. It is a place where we can have those conversations, and that's one that I'm not selling anyone on going there to. I feel very lucky. I landed on my feet, and I've been really
You'll be in
lucky.
trouble. We all want to join you now.
Show me up, man. But there's certainly a lot of interest in Kanban, how my team's working, and taking that a bit wider from some of the people who've done previous courses as well. So yeah.
Yeah, Philippa, to your point, in the chat, being able to have those conversations at management level. Oops. Just been topped. It's near unicorn in terms of how rare it's been in my experience. I think it depends on the kind of organization. I think when you look at owner led organizations, more mid-size, you will probably see this more because they have a genuine interest in actually improving.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah,
think also, yeah, sorry.
Sorry, no, I was just saying that you say my experience has been kind of good in kind of more horizontal, kind of flatter, because people kind of making decisions in management are closer to where the information they want to know about is happening. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, but yeah, I totally agree. Otherwise, yeah. Yeah. Cool.
I think also in companies where people are in for the long term as well. So as someone's built the company up from 10 people to 3 or 4,000 and really care about it,
yeah, developing
you often
relationship
find that as
definitely
well.
works. Kind of favors it. Yeah.
Yeah. And the trickier ones are those where you've had people work in that way for 20 years, and you only have these kind of people in the organization. Yeah.
I was in a discussion with somebody around, agility and various other things, and the whole theory X, theory Y, Douglas McGregor, intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, back from the human side of the enterprise in 1960, right? And theory Y being, all about growth and investment in people, unlocking people's intrinsic motivation and this kind of thing. And I increasingly think that if you want to get this stuff work, then theory Y management is almost a prerequisite. You won't shift a theory X management mindset, right? Particularly well or effectively. It takes a real bomb to do that. And it's actually L. David Marquette's book, Leadership is Language, because he was a US Navy guy who suddenly finds himself in charge of a submarine he knows nothing about, right? So he couldn't give orders anymore because he couldn't know the right orders to give. So all of a sudden he had to go from being really theory X, command and control, to being really theory Y and trusting his team. So turn the ship around, and leadership is language. And he uses Scrum as an example in that. It's a really interesting kind of flip. But he only flipped around, right? Because he had to. Right? There was an external threat, and it's quite hard to create that threat, really.
I'm wondering, should I stop the recording? We can still hang in and keep chatting. I'm wondering, like, are there any, let's put it like this, are there any questions like specifically for the talk left? And otherwise we can just hang in and
I had one kind of in the if there was any, did you see any evolution in the way in the things that you thought you were going to measure at the beginning and the things that you were kind of measuring or looking at as kind of the signs of progress? And
yes, unfortunately, history is now repeating itself, and I've just gone through the same thing again a little bit, right, just to reinforce that this happens. I think what I've seen is a greater understanding of the cost and the impact in the organization and a desire to change things long term, but often that takes time, right? But like I said, the understanding of context switching, the understanding of that being a problem, plus the whole, the more collaborative mindset with the business around prioritization of BAU, is this really important, and an understanding of that has been the most productive things in the last probably 3 or 4 months. So we're certainly heading in the right direction, but there's a long tail you've got to clear up before you can really move forward.
thank you.
Any more questions? Well, I'll stop the recording. Thank you very much. And I hope those guys that are watching it will enjoy it too. Thank you.
Thanks, Guy.
Yeah, thanks,
Cheers,
guys.
Ange.
Thanks, Sophie.
Right.
Good
Thank
job,
you,
mate.
everyone.
On the big screen, Tony, like it.